Hi everyone, I'm Panfergus. We're going to be talking about the origins of the SRPG genre and what kind of games influenced Fire Emblem Shining Force and Tetris Ogre and their respective designers such as Kaga, Matsuno, and Takahashi. Before this kind of point, before you really have video games, to that point you have most of these types of games influenced by D&D and its overall combat system. So some of the earlier games are probably going to take more of that kind of like D&D or inspiration going forward, and this is reflected in how they handle like classes or generally just how the combat system or stat systems are allocated out. But you'll gradually see more and more differences as time goes on throughout this. So we're going to be starting off with Dragon and Princess, which is widely considered to be the very first Japanese RPG or SRPG. It has relatively simplistic gameplay. However, you still will have things like units operating on a grid. You're able to move in different coordinates and things like that. Units can choose to skip their turns. There's still like different attacks and different types of enemies that they run across. There's not really that much as far as an overall kind of like story or narrative, unfortunately. It is probably one of Koei's earlier games, so we shouldn't expect too much in the way of production values, although by the time we get to Nobunaga's Ambition, there's a pretty big spike in that point. There's not even really much to go by as far as audio or anything along those lines. And despite being like an interesting kind of history lesson, you should be able to experience it for yourself too, given the fact that it has an English patch. One of the earliest games from Japan that you actually can get an English patch for. The other one being that you can get an English patch for the Japanese port of Wizardry. It's kind of neat. Then we'll be moving on to Bokosuka Wars. Still yet another like rudimentary or not particularly fleshed out or particularly that complicated game. It has very little in the way of like actual strategy mechanics. So how the game works is you bump into various different objects like trees, shrubs, like any kind of things, walls, rocks, and they'll usually end up giving you usually other dudes that tag along. Now, one of the kind of interesting concepts about it is that you have this kind of role swapping mechanic where you move between your king, a soldier, or a knight, and they all have different kind of roles. The knight helps you break open locks or keeping your allied soldiers in. Soldier helps you avoid instant death tiles, and the king breaks down different walls that you hit at different points of the game. Combat is automated, so that's relatively simplistic as far as things go along those lines. So you're not really going to find much in the way of strategy, but it's probably like the earliest origin of any kind of like Japanese real-time strategy kind of influence, which also influenced a couple other real-time games that we're going to run across. And most of these kind of things are tying back kind of to chess and the kind of like chessboard gameplay goes into Bokosuka. After that, we've got Nobunaga's Ambition, which probably his biggest influence of games like Brigandine or Dragon Force, with how you have to conquer like an overall map. Even at this point, being from 1983, you still have things like your lord has stats and things like that. Won't go by that. And you still have character death. So have different attributes that go through your given character, and also still has things like permadeath and stuff along those lines. Now, the other kind of neat thing is that it actually even, throughout most of the entries, has SRPG style combat. So it'll vary between one thing. Some of the games are more real-time as far as combat goes. Other ones are typically going to be more around the concept of kind of having like tactical turn-based battles throughout. So the other main point about it would be that you have probably the origins of not only just SRPGs going back to this kind of point, but you have like grand strategy games are influenced by this, strategy games. Obviously the SRPG genre as a whole, although you won't have too many games that will trace back their influence to something like this, mostly because most of them don't involve an in-depth map control aspect into them. So if you're looking for something kind of interesting to go back and check, there's multiple updated remakes that Koei made, such as the ones for like Genesis or later systems, so you don't have to go all the way back to the earliest Japanese computers to try out Nobunaga's Ambition. Probably one of the games that holds up the best on this overall list. And from that, we're going to be going into talking about First Queen. And First Queen is interesting because it's probably the first like true identifiable Japanese SRPG, kind of along the lines of what most people come to think of whenever they think of like SRPG content. You build up your units, they usually grow up and gain stats and all that kind of point. You run along to different kind of areas and get various recruits. It's typically cited as the main influence for Kaga and Takahashi, who made Fire Emblem and Shining Force. Both of them really liked the games by Kuro Software. And even by like 1988, you have a pretty big difference in terms of like level of quality and like distinctive features within the genre. And the other kind of cool part is you'll be able to get like various monsters or different types of units along those lines as you go. And it has like an overall world map that you traverse with different forts where you can position your units at. And that lets you defend when like, there's enemy invasions coming towards you. Overall, a relatively complex game for the time period that it came out. And really pretty easy to recommend because it's managed to hold up fairly well. Now, the only kind of problem with it is the only version that exists in English is a remake that unfortunately has a couple like pay-to-win mechanics that they tied in when they ported it. And that's currently available on Steam. Hopefully, eventually, this will manage to get like a normal English patch for one of the versions that exist for First Queen. It is relatively historically important as far as the SRPG genre goes. And ideally, if something like that will happen, we'll probably get Silver Ghost, which is the other game that plays pretty similar to First Queen. They're not too particularly different from each other. Both of the games are relatively similar and operate on pretty much the same engine, as far as I could tell, from what I experienced of them. And finally, we're going to be going off to Destiny of an Emperor by Capcom, which is pretty neat in that two of the main people behind it, Fujiwara, went on to go work on Mega Man Strider, Sweet Home, Ghosts and Goblins, and then Okamoto worked on Final Fight and Resident Evil. So, pretty big pedigree. Now, one of the kind of neat things about the game is it has like a ration and supply system that you get to work through to keep your army going and all that kind of stuff. So you kind of build up this thing, you recruit various characters, all the way up to actually 150 different characters can join you. Even some of the enemies that you defeat in combat will end up becoming party members that you can use and go in to fight different characters. Combat systems, effectively you just go in and defeat things using like a formation that you set up. You usually get a tactics character who influences what kind of like spells you effectively use in the game, because the game really in RPG mechanics would treat spells as tactics. Holds up pretty well for 1989. Relatively in-depth combat, pretty decently long game, even has branching paths. But if you like this video and like to hear more things about the overall genre, make sure to check out our other genres. We're going to be talking about Origins, various SRPG games, and other genres. So, peace out.